Sanctions. 18. The UN Security Council resolution endorsing this JCPOA will terminate all provisions of previous UN Security Council resolutions on the Iranian nuclear issue 1696, 2006, 1737, 2006, 1747, 2007, 1803, 2008, 1835, 2008, 1929, 2010, and 2224, 2015, simultaneously with the IAEA-verified implementation of agreed nuclear-related measures by Iran, and will establish specific restrictions, as specified in Annex 5. Quote by John Kerry: "Remember that sanctions did not stop Iran's nuclear program from growing steadily, to the point it had accumulated enough low-enriched uranium that, if further enriched, could be used to produce about 10 nuclear bombs. The truth is that the Vienna Plan will provide a stronger, more comprehensive, and more lasting means of limiting Iran's nuclear program than any realistic alternative." 19. The EU will terminate all provisions of the EU regulation, as subsequently amended, implementing all nuclear-related economic and financial sanctions, including related designations, simultaneously with the IAEA-verified implementation of agreed nuclear-related measures by Iran as specified in Annex V, which cover all sanctions and restrictive measures in the following areas, as described in Annex 2. 1. Transfers of funds between EU persons and entities, including financial institutions, and Iranian persons and entities, including financial institutions. 2. Banking activities, including the establishment of new correspondent banking relationships and the opening of new branches and subsidiaries of Iranian banks in the territories of EU member states. 3. Provision of insurance and reinsurance. 4. Supply of specialized financial messaging services, including SWIFT, for persons and entities set out in Attachment 1 to Annex 2, including the Central Bank of Iran and Iranian financial institutions. 5. Financial support for trade with Iran, export credit, guarantees or insurance. 6. Commitments for grants, financial assistance, and concessional loans to the government of Iran. 7. Transactions in public or public guaranteed bonds. 8. Import and transport of Iranian oil, petroleum products, gas, and petrochemical products. 9. Export of key equipment or technology for the oil, gas, and petrochemical sectors. 10. Investment in the oil, gas, and petrochemical sectors. 11. Export of key naval equipment and technology. 12. Design and construction of cargo vessels and oil tankers. 13. Provision of flagging and classification services. 14. Access to EU airports of Iranian cargo flights. 15. Export of gold, precious metals, and diamonds. 16. Delivery of Iranian banknotes and coinage. 17. Export of graphite, raw or semi-finished metals such as aluminum and steel, and export or software for integrating industrial processes. 18. Designation of persons, entities, and bodies, asset freeze and visa ban, set out in Attachment 1 to Annex 2, and 19. Associated services for each of the categories above. 20. The EU will terminate all provisions of the EU regulation implementing all EU proliferation-related sanctions, including related designations, 8 years after adoption day or when the IAEA has reached the broader conclusion that all nuclear material in Iran remains in peaceful activities, whichever is earlier. 21. The United States will cease the application, and will continue to do so, in accordance with this JCPOA of the sanctions specified in Annex 2 to take effect simultaneously with the IAEA-verified implementation of the agreed nuclear-related measures by Iran as specified in Annex V. Such sanctions cover the following areas as described in Annex 2. 1. Financial and banking transactions with Iranian banks and financial institutions as specified in Annex 2, including the Central Bank of Iran and specified individuals and entities identified as Government of Iran by the Office of Foreign Assets Control on the Specially Designated Nationals and Blocked Persons List, SDN list, as set out in Attachment 3 to Annex 2, including the opening and maintenance of correspondent and payable through accounts at non-U.S. financial institutions. Investments, foreign exchange transactions and letters of credit. 2. Transactions in Iranian rial. 3. Provision of U.S. banknotes to the government of Iran. 4. Bilateral trade limitations on Iranian revenues abroad, including limitations on their transfer. 5. Purchase, subscription to, or facilitation of the issuance of Iranian sovereign debt, including governmental bonds. 6. Financial messaging services to the Central Bank of Iran and Iranian financial institutions set out in Attachment 3 to Annex 2. 7. Underwriting services, insurance or reinsurance. 8. Efforts to reduce Iran's crude oil sales. 9. Investment, including participation in joint ventures, goods, services, information, technology and technical expertise and support for Iran's oil, gas, and petrochemical sectors. 10. Purchase, acquisition, sale, transportation, or marketing of petroleum, petrochemical products and natural gas from Iran. 11. Export, sale, or provision of refined petroleum products and petrochemical products to Iran. 12. Transactions with Iran's energy sector. 13. Transactions with Iran's shipping and shipbuilding sectors and port operators. 14. Trade in gold and other precious metals. 15. Trade with Iran in graphite, raw or semi-finished metals such as aluminum and steel, coal, and software for integrating industrial processes. 16. Sale, supply, or transfer of goods and services used in connection with Iran's automotive sector. 17. Sanctions on associated services for each of the categories above. 18. Remove individuals and entities set out in Attachment 3 to Annex 2 from the SDN list, the Foreign Sanctions Evaders list, and / or the Non-SDN Iran Sanctions Act list, and 19. Terminate Executive Orders 13,574, 13,590, 13,622, and 13,645, and Sections 5, 7 and 15 of Executive Order 13,628. Quote by Secretary Liu: Iran will not receive any new relief until it fulfills all of the key nuclear-related commitments specified in the deal. Should Iran fully comply with the terms of the JCPOA, and should the IAEA verify this compliance, phased sanctions relief will come into effect and the JCPOA will address the danger of Iran's nuclear program, lowering the overall threat posture and freeing us and our allies to check Iran's regional activities more aggressively, while keeping our sanctions on support for terrorist activity in place. The United States will also maintain powerful sanctions targeting Iran's support for terrorist groups such as Hezbollah and its sponsors in Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force, its destabilizing support to the Houthis in Yemen, its backing of Assad's brutal regime, its missile program, and its human rights abuses at home. More broadly, our primary trade embargo will continue to prohibit U.S. persons from investing in Iran, importing or exporting most goods and services, or otherwise dealing with most Iranian persons and companies. Iran, in other words, will continue to be denied access to the world's largest financial and commercial market. 22. The United States will, as specified in Annex 2 and in accordance with Annex 5, allow for the sale of commercial passenger aircraft and related parts and services to Iran, license non-U.S. persons that are owned or controlled by a U.S. person to engage in activities with Iran consistent with this JCPOA, and license the importation into the United States of Iranian origin carpets and foodstuffs. 23. 8 years after Adoption Day, or when the IAEA has reached the broader conclusion that all nuclear material in Iran remains in peaceful activities, whichever is earlier, the United States will seek such legislative action as may be appropriate to terminate, or modify to effectuate the termination of, the sanctions specified in Annex 2 on the acquisition of nuclear-related commodities and services for nuclear activities contemplated in this JCPOA, to be consistent with the U.S. approach to other non-nuclear weapon states under the NPT. Quote by Secretary Liu: should Iran fulfill all of the necessary conditions, we will have reached what it is known as Implementation Day, and phased relief will begin. At that time, the United States will suspend nuclear-related secondary sanctions. These are the sanctions that primarily target third country parties conducting business with Iran, including in the oil, banking, and shipping sectors. 24. The E3/EU and the United States specify in Annex 2 a full and complete list of all nuclear-related sanctions or restrictive measures and will lift them in accordance with Annex 5. Annex 2 also specifies the effects of the lifting of sanctions beginning on implementation day. If at any time following the implementation day, Iran believes that any other nuclear-related sanction or restrictive measure of the E3/EU+3 is preventing the full implementation of the sanctions lifting as specified in this JCPOA, the JCPOA participant in question will consult with Iran with a view to resolving the issue and, if they concur that lifting of this sanction or restrictive measure is appropriate, the JCPOA participant in question will take appropriate action. If they are not able to resolve the issue, Iran or any member of the E3/EU+3 may refer the issue to the Joint Commission. 25. If a law at the state or local level in the United States is preventing the implementation of the sanctions lifting as specified in this JCPOA, the United States will take appropriate steps, taking into account all available authorities, with a view to achieving such implementation. The United States will actively encourage officials at the state or local level to take into account the changes in the U.S. policy reflected in the lifting of sanctions under this JCPOA and to refrain from actions inconsistent with this change in policy. 26. The EU will refrain from reintroducing or reimposing the sanctions that it has terminated implementing under this JCPOA, without prejudice to the dispute resolution process provided for under this JCPOA. There will be no new nuclear-related UN Security Council sanctions and no new EU nuclear-related sanctions or restrictive measures. The United States will make best efforts in good faith to sustain this JCPOA and to prevent interference with the realization of the full benefit by Iran of the sanctions lifting specified in Annex 2. The U.S. administration, acting consistent with the respective roles of the President and the Congress, will refrain from reintroducing or reimposing the sanctions specified in Annex 2 that it has ceased applying under this JCPOA, without prejudice to the dispute resolution process provided for under this JCPOA. The U.S. administration, acting consistent with the respective roles of the President and the Congress, will refrain from imposing new nuclear-related sanctions. Iran has stated that it will treat such a reintroduction or reimposition of the sanctions specified in Annex 2, or such an imposition of new nuclear-related sanctions, as grounds to cease performing its commitments under this JCPOA in whole or in part. 27. The E3/EU+3 will take adequate administrative and regulatory measures to ensure clarity and effectiveness with respect to the lifting of sanctions under this JCPOA. The EU and its member states as well as the United States will issue relevant guidelines and make publicly accessible statements on the details of sanctions or restrictive measures which have been lifted under this JCPOA. The EU and its member states and the United States commit to consult with Iran regarding the content of such guidelines and statements, on a regular basis and whenever appropriate. 28. The E3/EU+3 and Iran commit to implement this JCPOA in good faith and in a constructive atmosphere, based on mutual respect, and to refrain from any action inconsistent with the letter, spirit, and intent of this JCPOA that would undermine its successful implementation. Senior government officials of the E3/EU+3 and Iran will make every effort to support the successful implementation of this JCPOA, including in their public statements. The E3/EU+3 will take all measures required to lift sanctions and will refrain from imposing exceptional or discriminatory regulatory and procedural requirements in lieu of the sanctions and restrictive measures covered by the JCPOA. Quote by Secretary Liu: "While our focus is on successfully implementing this deal, we must guard against the possibility that Iran does not uphold its side of the deal. That is why, should Iran violate its commitments once we have suspended sanctions, we have the mechanisms ready to snap them back into place. For U.S. sanctions, this can be done in a matter of days. Multilateral sanctions at the UN also can be reimposed quickly, through a mechanism that does not allow any one country or any group of countries to prevent the reinstitution of the current UN Security Council sanctions if Iran violates the deal." 29. The EU and its member states and the United States, consistent with their respective laws, will refrain from any policy specifically intended to directly and adversely affect the normalization of trade and economic relations with Iran, inconsistent with their commitments not to undermine the successful implementation of this JCPOA. 30. The E3/EU+3 will not apply sanctions or restrictive measures to persons or entities for engaging in activities covered by the lifting of sanctions provided for in this JCPOA, provided that such activities are otherwise consistent with E3/EU+3 laws and regulations in effect. Following the lifting of sanctions under this JCPOA as specified in Annex 2, ongoing investigations on possible infringements of such sanctions may be reviewed in accordance with applicable national laws. Quote by Secretary Liu: if a company does business with Iran while the sanctions are lifted, that would be permitted. If Iran violates the deal and the sanctions snap back, they would not be able to continue doing things that are in violation of the sanctions even if the contract began before sanctions were snapped back. 31. Consistent with the timing specified in Annex 5, the EU and its member states will terminate the implementation of the measures applicable to designated entities and individuals, including the Central Bank of Iran and other Iranian banks and financial institutions, as detailed in Annex 2 and the attachments thereto. Consistent with the timing specified in Annex 5, the United States will remove designation of certain entities and individuals on the specially designated nationals and blocked persons list, and entities and individuals listed on the foreign sanctions evaders list, as detailed in Annex 2 and the attachments thereto. Quote by Secretary Liu: if a company does business with Iran while the sanctions are lifted, that would be permitted. If Iran violates the deal and the sanctions snap back, they would not be able to continue doing things that are in violation of the sanctions even if the contract began before sanctions were snapped back. 32. EU and E3+3 countries and international participants will engage in joint projects with Iran, including through IAEA technical cooperation projects, in the field of peaceful nuclear technology, including nuclear power plants, research reactors, fuel fabrication, agreed joint advanced R&D such as fusion, establishment of a state-of-the-art regional nuclear medical center, personnel training, nuclear safety and security, and environmental protection, as detailed in Annex 3. They will take necessary measures, as appropriate, for the implementation of these projects. 33. The E3/EU+3 and Iran will agree on steps to ensure Iran's access in areas of trade, technology, finance, and energy. The EU will further explore possible areas for cooperation between the EU, its member states and Iran, and in this context consider the use of available instruments such as export credits to facilitate trade, project financing, and investment in Iran.